Our story today is The Donkey's Owner, and is found in Matthew 21, 1 to 11, Mark 11, 1 to 11, and Luke 19, 28 to 35. Living on the edge of the village had advantages, but today one resident of Jerusalem could see only the disadvantages. With worshippers pouring into town, the dust and noise was heavy. Even though the traffic quieted after dark, the man still hadn't slept well, and for good reason. Among the throngs of worshippers, there were also bandits looking to swipe a bag, swindle a fool, or conspire with an accomplice. He rubbed his hands over his face to convince himself it was morning. Outside, the donkeys confirmed it as they bellowed for breakfast. He recited his daily prayers and went out to feed and water his animals. The fidgety colt bumped the grain bucket away and turned to his mother, forgetting she was dry, and then went back to sniff the grain. The man patted the colt, and the colt shook his head in protest. Surly as a toddler, he thought. If broken in time, the colt would mean twice the plowing power at planting time. But now that it had been weaned, it was just another mouth to feed. And with the Romans exacting taxes on top of his obligations to the temple in Jerusalem, there was little left, even in a good year for his family and livestock. And still, he was glad for the colt, stubborn as it was. It had worn a bare spot chafing against the halter. I know, he said, and pulled it over the colt's ears and hung the halter on the fence post. Tying a lead rope around its neck, he tended to the rest of his work. In addition to the constant responsibilities of supporting his family and feeding livestock, political concerns whirled in his mind. He looked up and down the road as if a Roman centurion might be there to convict him of his thoughts. There had been so much talk of Messiah in Jerusalem, a man who would finally, after all these years, deliver God's people from the oppressive Romans. And the Romans, not to mention Herod, were as testy as starved wolves at the thought of being replaced. Others had made the same claim. Each had risen to fame and died with their homegrown armies, so he knew he ought to be skeptical. But all the men with any personal power to stake were on high alert, listening for the quiet crumbling of an empire built on sand. The most recent one to stir up Jerusalem, however, was a man called Jesus. The temple leaders declared him another charismatic bandit. He had amassed not so much a homegrown army as a following of strange and unremarkable people. Folks formerly crippled or blind, tax collectors and fishermen, even tradesmen and women, commoners, people like me, he thought. Jesus was different in every way from the ones who'd claimed to be Messiah before. He confounded his opponents with unanswerable questions. He taught in riddles and parables, and yet he spoke with authority. He had no discernible political agenda and had no paid recruiters, and still the crowds flocked to him, while the morning sunlight exposed the dust drifting into the village as travelers trickled along the road. He shielded his eyes from the sun and watched. Jesus was probably down there somewhere. A Messiah would surely attend the Passover. He lifted his hand to greet a neighbor and went around back to get water for the animals. And just as he dunked the bucket into the well, he heard his neighbor shouting, "Hey, why are you untying his colt?" Then he heard the bellowing coming from the donkeys. He rushed back to the front just in time to see two men working the knots loose. He ran toward the commotion just as the colt reared and leaned into its mother. "What are you doing?" he demanded. The unapologetic stranger didn't run, but they didn't seem to want to fight either. There was hesitation, and then the younger one answered, "The Lord needs it." The Lord? So he was down there in the midst of them, on his way to the Passover, no doubt. He exhaled, glanced down at the mare and her colt, and then back at the two strangers. The colt is weaned, but he hasn't been ridden before. He examined the balding spot where the halter had been. If the Lord needs it, take him. He grabbed the halter from where it hung on the post, fitted it over the colt's ears, and held out the lead rope. "Thank you," said the young man. "The Lord will send it back here shortly." "Fine." He smoothed the colt's hide as he brushed by. They led it down the road and into the warmth of midday, threw their cloaks over its back. As they merged into the current of Passover pilgrims, they stopped to pick up a rider. To his astonishment, the colt did not buckle or buck. The stubborn animal, who had brayed for the safety of his mother and reared up for strangers, now carried the Lord through the gracious celebration straight toward Jerusalem. On the back of an unbroken colt, Jesus was headed to the cross to initiate the great exchange, his perfection in exchange for our sin. But he wouldn't stop there. The exchange offered in Christ's work on the cross was just the beginning of every other exchange he offered to initiate in our lives. He doesn't need anything from us, but he accepts whatever we're willing to relinquish, even if all we have to offer seems undesirable and unruly. Sometimes we believe we must offer Jesus something big and nice, surely something nicer than an untamed donkey. We feel obligated to demonstrate great faith and super sacrifice because we've come to believe God is impressed by ark building and giant slaying. But God is neither impressed nor persuaded by the magnitude of what we do. He's not disappointed when we offer him, for example, our worries instead of our works. Worries steal sleep and interrupt concentration, and God has offered to take them from our trembling hands. When we behold Jesus and trust that he is not shocked or surprised by what we have to give him, then he can tame an anxious heart. Wild worries are broken under his control. Likewise, God is not discouraged when we hand him a worn pattern of frantic striving, when we relinquish a lifestyle of panting and rushing under the load of should-haves. He accepts it as a token of our dependence on his grace. Instead of leaving a void where worry and striving used to be, he offers an exchange. He will exchange worry for relief because he knows what we need before we ask. He will exchange striving for rest because the work of earning God's favor is already finished. Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest, he beckons, Matthew 11:28. When we relinquish the wild things in him, we can rest beneath his smile. We can glimpse what he meant by easy yoke and light burden. The end result will be unbridled worship for the one who initiated the exchange. Lord, thank you for giving rest and peace in exchange for all the untamed anxieties we seem to conjure up. When you ask us to let go of worries and frantic striving, help us remember it is for our benefit and your glory. We are humbled and thankful, and you are magnified in worship. Help us relinquish whatever you ask. And thank you for listening, and have a good day.